Hello ladies and gentlemen, in this video I'll show you how to add Redux to your Expo Firebase application. Redux is a library that's commonly used in React Native applications to store and share data across screens. It can be a little bit tricky to set up at first, but once you get it configured, it works very well and can be very useful. As you can see, I've got my application up and running, and the point where we're starting at is the Expo Firebase Auth Starter application, which you can find at this GitHub repository, or you can follow along with the Expo Firebase Auth Starter video. Now before we begin, one small thing I want to do is clean up this test screen a little bit. I want to delete the test component and the hello text that we added in a previous video, so I'll delete those out and save it. And it looks nice and clean. Now before we can use Redux, we need to install the Redux library, and in fact there are 3 libraries that we want to install for this video. The way that you install packages is you type npm install -S for save, and then list out the libraries that you want to install, which for us is going to be Redux space React Redux and Redux-thunk. And I'll explain what each of those does throughout the video. So while that's installing, we will set up our project directory to use Redux. The way that I do it personally is I add a new folder called Redux, and inside of that I add a file called app-redux.js. And I actually put all of my Redux stuff in the same file. If you look at tutorials online, you'll see that often people split it up into different files, but I personally think it's more convenient to have everything in one file. If your application is very complex, it might make more sense to split it up, but for me, I like to keep everything contained in here. Now we'll be adding to this file many times throughout the video, but there are a few things we can go ahead and get started on immediately. So the first thing we can do is import some libraries from Redux. So we will import create store and apply middleware from Redux. And let's also import thunk middleware from Redux-thunk. Now there are many components that we will piece together in a Redux application, and the way that I like to visually separate them is I create a couple lines of comments just to make it a little bit easier for me to see. The first component that we want to add is our initial state, and all this is a data structure that represents the initial state of the application. So you might want everything to be blank, and what we'll do is create a variable called initial state, and whatever you want in your application you'll add here. So just as an example, we'll put a favorite animal variable and we'll call it duck. Alright, the next component is called your reducer, and the reducer specifies how the state is changed based on various actions that we're going to add later. So I'm going to put a comment here called reducer, and reducers are very easy to create. You just make a variable called reducer if you want, and give it a state that you set to the initial state and an action, and we will actually fill this in later, but this is going to take an action and figure out what it needs to do to the state based on that action. Alright, the next component of a Redux application is the store, and stores are also easy to create. So we'll create a variable called store, and this is where the create store function that we imported from Redux comes in handy. So we call create store, and we give it our reducer that we just created above, and apply middleware with thunk middleware. And you don't need to worry too much about that right now. That will come in handy later on in the video. And we're going to need to reference our store in other places, so we will export the store here as well. Alright, that should be enough to get us going for the time being, and now we want to actually connect our application to Redux. So we'll open up our app.js, and we need to import a few libraries. The first thing we're going to import is something called provider from the React-Redux library. Now this provides us our application with data, and the next thing we want to import is the store that we just created from our Redux file, which is in redux/app-redux. So save that and make sure everything is working. And then to actually connect it, we come down here to our main application and we add the provider component, and we provide it with a property called store, which is the store that we created. And now our application should have access to Redux. So to test out that our application is connected to Redux, let's try to display the value of favorite animal inside of the test screen. Now, before we can do that, we need to take a look at the reducer. What the reducer does is it takes an action and it manipulates the state based on that action. So you might have an action called set favorite animal, and you might do something like this: if action.type equals set favorite animal, then you would say state.favorite animal equals something. And we'll add a few actions later, but for now, we're just going to return the state as it is. We're not going to make any changes to it. We'll just return it as it is, which should be our initial state, because if we're not making any changes to it, it will remain at the initial state. So now whenever we use our reducer, it will return the state. Now we'll open up our test screen, and we want to connect the test screen to Redux. So in order to connect it, we need to use the connect component from React Redux. And we also need to modify our class just a little bit. Instead of exporting it right here, we're going to delete that and just declare our class test screen. And down here, we're going to export the class. We'll say export default, and we're going to use the connect component that we just imported. Now connect takes a couple of parameters that we will define in just a second. Let's call them map state to props and map dispatch to props. And then we pass in our screen, which is test screen. Okay, now let's define map state to props and map dispatch to props. And we'll do it at the top of the class, or the top of the file. We'll create a variable called map state to props. And what this does is it takes the state from Redux and applies it to your component's properties. So you can return an object, and whatever properties you put in your object will be available in the component's properties. So we want to create a property called favorite animal, and the value of it is the state.favorite animal, which, if you recall, maps back to here. So we have in our Redux state, we have a property called favorite animal, which initially is set to duck, and we're now adding that value to our component's properties. Map dispatch to props works the same way, except it takes a dispatch, which we'll talk about later, and also applies that to your properties. And since we're not working with it right now, we'll just return a blank object. So what this means is now our test screen should have a property called favorite animal, whose value is the state.favoriteAnimal value. So if we try to display that in a text, we can do it like this: text this.props.favoriteAnimal in the text, and we'll save it and refresh and see. Now we see we have the value of duck. And if I changed my favorite animal to lion and saved, we now get lion here. And I'll switch it back to duck. All right, now let's allow the user to change the favorite animal. So let's give them a text input and a button, and when they type into the text input and click the button, it will update their favorite animal. So we'll get our text input here and a button. Button will be called set favorite animal, and when we press it, it will call this dot on set favorite animal press. And up here we will create that function on set favorite animal press. All right, and for our text input, we need something in our state to hold the value of the text input. So let's add a constructor here. Remember, you need to call super props, and we set our state like this, and let's give our state also a variable called favorite animal, and we'll initialize it actually with this.props.favoriteAnimal. All right, and down here in our text input, we'll set its value equal to this.state.favoriteAnimal. And when the text changes, it'll give us a function with the text value. And we'll call this .setState, and we'll set our favorite animal to the text of the input. So let's save that and make sure everything's working. There's our text input. It's a little bit hard to tell, so why don't we add a border around it. Border width of 1, we'll give it a width of 200 and a height of 40. Alright, so here's our text input, and as you can see, it's got the initial value of our favorite animal. And once we implement this function, hopefully when we click set favorite animal, it will set our favorite animal. So this is an opportunity for us to use an action creator, which is another concept in Redux. So if we switch over to our app Redux file, let's add another section called action creators. And these could be functions that create actions. So we want to make one called set favorite animal. And it's going to be a function that takes a favorite animal as an input. And the way that this works is it returns an object that will be used as an action in our reducer, which you'll see in just a second. So we want to return an object, and it's a Redux convention to give every action creator a type. So our type here will just, for convention, we'll always name it the same as the function name. So we'll say the type is set favorite animal, and you can add whatever properties you want. So we'll give it a value which is equal to the favorite animal. And we also will want to reference these in other files, so let's export set favorite animal, like so. Now, up in our reducer, what we were doing before was just returning the state, but now that we have different actions, we need to do some logic based on those actions. So another common Redux pattern is to use a switch statement and switch on the action.type. And we'll say case set favorite animal. So if that was the action that we were given, we'll do something there. And we'll, for our default case, we will just return state. And we can do this, get rid of this now, because the default will occur if any of the cases in the switch are unsuccessful. So in the case of set favorite animal, what you need to do is return a new state that's updated based on the action that you were given. So in this case, we want to actually update the favorite animal. So the way that you commonly do this is you return an object and you use this ... state, which kind of gives you all the values of the state. And then when you do a comma, you can update things in there. So we'll update our favorite animal, and the value is going to be the value from the object. So it's action.value. And like I said, you can name this anything you want. You could have named this favorite animal if you'd like. And in this case, it would be action.favorite animal. But I kind of like value, so I'm going to keep it as value. All right, now we're good to go. Now whenever we call this set favorite animal action creator, it should go into our reducer and update our state's favorite animal. So back over on our test screen, now we need to import set favorite animal from our Redux file. So that's redux/app-redux. And this is where we start to use our map dispatch to props. So what we want to do in here is we want to actually add our set favorite animal. So again, whatever properties you return in this object are going to be available in your components property. So we'll just name it set favorite animal. And this is going to be a function that takes some text, and it's a little bit confusing, but what you do is you call dispatch, which is what we're given here, and then you call the set favorite animal function. This is the one that we actually imported up here, and we give it the value that we were given in this function call, which is text. So what that's going to do is that's going to dispatch this action. It's going to call this function, and it will return this object, go into our reducer. The reducer will figure out that this is the action we called based on the type, and it will update our state with the favorite animal being the value that was given. And like I said, I know it's a little bit confusing, so If you just want to copy the syntax here and not worry about it too much, that's perfectly fine. All right, so we should be set up now. We should have a property in our component called setFavoriteAnimal. So when we click on setFavoriteAnimal press, what we can do is this.props.setFavoriteAnimal, and the value we'll give it is this.state.favoriteAnimal. And we'll save that, and we should be able to test it out now. So if I change duck to lion and I click set favorite animal, now you see that our display updates to the favorite animal. Now when I was first learning this, I was very confused because there are so many different pieces that you got to connect together in order to use Redux. But like I said, once you have it all set up, it works very well, and it's a great way for you to get data shared across all of your different screens without having to pass them around as properties. Let's do a quick recap of what we've got so far, just in case you got lost. And like I said, if you're still lost, you can just copy this code and figure out how it works without necessarily knowing all the mechanics of it. So up here we've imported some libraries from the various Redux libraries. Here we've specified our initial state, and you can set whatever data you want in this data structure, and that will be the initial state of your Redux data store. Down here's the reducer, which takes actions and updates the state accordingly. And we can maybe reformat this, make it look a little bit nicer. So we have one action so far, which is set favorite animal, and what it does is it returns a new state, which has, what this does is it gives you the current state, and then this kind of overrides the favorite animal property of that state. And the way that it overrides it is it takes the value from the action it's given and overrides it. Down here we have our store, which actually contains all the data. It's just a data store. And down here we have our action creators, and the one that we created so far is set favorite animal, and it's a function that takes a favorite animal as an input, and it returns an object with a type called set favorite animal and a value of favorite animal. And again, this is used up here in the reducer. The type helps us figure out what kind of state update we want to do, and the value helps us figure out how we actually want to update the state. Over here on our test screen, we connected this screen to Redux by using the connect function, and we passed in map state to props and map dispatch to props, as well as our test screen. What these two functions do here is they set up the properties of your component based on things that are in your Redux data store. So map state to props takes the current state of the Redux data store and sets any properties you want for this particular screen. You can do as many or as few as you'd like. In our case, we wanted to see the favorite animal, so we added a property called favorite animal and set its value to the state.favoriteAnimal. Map dispatch to props does the same thing, except it takes the Redux dispatch, which allows you to dispatch action creators, which is what we did here. We created a property called setFavoriteAnimal, which we can call in our component from this.props.setFavoriteAnimal and give it the text of a favorite animal. And what it'll do is it'll dispatch the setFavoriteAnimal action creator that we imported here, giving it the text that we supplied. And one more time, what this does is this goes through here, calls the action creator, which creates this action object. The dispatch sends it to the reducer, and the reducer uses the action type to figure out what we need to do, and the action value to figure out how to update the state. Very confusing, I know, but hopefully you were able to follow along with that. Now, since this is a Firebase application, I want to demonstrate how to integrate Firebase and Redux. There are a couple of challenges with Firebase. First, since it's over the network, we're dealing with asynchronous communication. And second, since Firebase is a real-time database, we want to update our data store anytime the data in Firebase updates. So first, let's jump over to Firebase and create a little bit of sample data for us to work with. So I'm in my project, I'll go to database, get started, and I want to add a node called person and give it a property called first name of Paul and an additional property last name O'Neill. Alright, so this gives us some data to work with. Now let's jump back into our code, and in our app Redux file, let's add a new property called person data. So in our initial store, we're going to initialize person data to just be a blank object. And down here in our action creators, we want to create another one called set person data, which is going to take a person data input, and it's going to return a type of set person data and a value equal to that person data. And we'll need to update our reducer in case we receive that type of action. So we'll add another case here called set person data. And we will return our current state, but we'll override person data with action.value, which again comes from right here. All right, now we want to integrate Firebase. So up at the top here, let's import star as Firebase from Firebase, so that we can reference Firebase in our Redux file. And we'll create an additional action creator, and we'll call this watch person data, because Firebase is a real-time database, so we're going to be watching the data for updates. So this will be a function. We won't take any inputs, but you can if you want. And in this case, we're going to return a function rather than an object, and that function is going to take dispatch. And inside of this function, we will set up our Firebase watch. Now, ordinarily, you wouldn't be able to do this type of thing in Redux. This is where the Thunk middleware actually comes into play. So because we're applying the Thunk middleware right here, it allows us to have action creators that are functions rather than just objects. So inside of this function, let's call the Firebase API, so firebase.database.ref person, that's the node we want to look at. And on value, it'll give us a function with a snapshot if it's successful, and a function with an error if it is unsuccessful. So if we are successful, we will have a person data equal to the snapshot's value, which you can get by calling the val function. And then in order to actually update that in our store, we will call dispatch, which is given to us as an input. And we'll call the set person data action creator that we just created up here with the person data that we just retrieved from the snapshot. And for now, let's just ignore errors, but you could call another action creator that maybe sets an error message or something like that if you wanted. So we'll save that and make sure everything is working okay. All right, now we need to go, well, first we should export these action creators. So set person data and watch person data. Now we have access to them outside of this file. And we'll go into our test screen, and we'll actually want to import watch person data, because that's what we're going to call. So test screen will call watch person data. Watch person data will set up this Firebase watch, and anytime the person data value is updated, it'll call this function, which will dispatch a set person data action, which will then come up to our reducer and set the person's data to whatever the value is. So we now have watch person data. Let's add that to our properties, which we'll do right here. Watch person data is going to be a function with no inputs, and it's going to dispatch the watch person data action creator. All right, now that's in our properties, and let's come down to our constructor and actually call this function, which will initialize the watching of data. So we'll say this.props.watch person data, and let's save it and make sure everything works okay. And the only way to really find out if it's working is to display that data somehow. So let's go up to our map state to props, and let's grab the person data out of the state. So state.person data. And down here, let's display the person data. So we'll add a text, and we'll do this.props.person data.first name, and this.props.person data.last name. Save it and see if we get our person data to display. So there we have Paul O'Neill. And now let's double check that the real-time aspect of the Firebase database is working. So I'm going to jump over to the Firebase database here, and I'll change the first name to Steve. And this should have fired a change event over here, and there you go, it has updated to Steve. And that's all there is to it for adding Redux to your Expo Firebase application. Like I said, I know it can be a little bit overwhelming with all the different pieces you need to keep track of, but once you've got the basic structure built in, it's pretty easy to add new action creators, to add new state variables, and to have access to them in your different screens. And like I said, it's very convenient to use compared to the alternative of just passing data around with properties. Thank you for watching the video, and please subscribe if you'd like to be notified of updates.